The corner office on the 40th floor had witnessed hundreds of negotiations, but never one like this. Vivian Sterling stood behind her mahogany desk, her fingers trembling against the cold glass surface as she faced the man she had secretly watched for 2 years. Derek Holloway, the quiet accountant from the 12th floor, the single father who always left early to pick up his daughter, now stood before her with an expression she couldn't read. "I need a baby, or I lose everything." The words escaped her lips, raw and desperate, stripped of the CEO mask she wore like armor. The city lights flickered 40 stories below, indifferent to the earthquake happening in this room. Derek didn't flinch. He didn't ask for explanations. Instead, he rose slowly from his chair, his eyes holding something between challenge and compassion. "Meet my condition tonight." Vivian Sterling had closed billion-dollar deals without breaking a sweat. But this single sentence, from a man who earned less than her weekly bonus, left her completely speechless. What condition could a single dad possibly demand from a woman who had everything except the one thing money couldn't buy? 3 hours earlier, the afternoon sun had streamed through those same floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across Vivian's pristine office. She had been reviewing quarterly reports when her assistant's voice crackled through the intercom, announcing that Mr. Harrison from Sterling & Associates Legal was on line 1. Vivian had known Theodore Harrison since she was 12 years old, back when he was just a junior associate working under her father. Now, he was the executor of her father's estate, and the weight in his voice told her this wasn't a routine call. "Vivian, there's a clause in your father's will that we need to discuss. He added it 6 months before he passed, and he specifically requested that I not reveal it until 2 years after his death." Theodore paused, and Vivian could hear him shuffling papers on the other end. "The 2 years are up next week, but I thought you should know now. Your father stipulated that if you don't have a biological child within 6 months of this disclosure, controlling interest in Sterling Industries will transfer to the board of directors." The words hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle. Vivian gripped the edge of her desk, her knuckles turning white against the dark wood. Her father, even from the grave, was still trying to control her life. She had spent 42 years proving herself to a man who never once told her he was proud, who measured love in profit margins and success in market shares. And now this, his final move in a chess game she never agreed to play. 6 months, she repeated, her voice hollow. He gave me 6 months to find someone, fall in love, get married, and have a child. Does he realize how biology works? Theodore cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Vivian, I think his intention was for you to already be in a relationship by now. He always worried that you were too focused on the company, that you were becoming—" He stopped himself, but Vivian finished the sentence in her head, that she was becoming just like him. Cold, alone, married to nothing but work. After hanging up, Vivian stood at the window, watching the city pulse below like a living organism. Somewhere down there, in one of those tiny apartments with their warm yellow lights, people were coming home to families. Children were running into their parents' arms. Couples were cooking dinner together, arguing about what to watch on television, falling asleep tangled in each other's warmth. She had never known any of that. Her mother had left when she was 4, unable to compete with her father's first love, the company. And her father had raised her the only way he knew how, with spreadsheets and strategy meetings, and the constant reminder that Sterling women didn't need anyone. But standing there, with the weight of his final ultimatum pressing down on her chest, Vivian realized something that made her heart ache. Her father hadn't done this to punish her. He had done it because he knew. He knew what it felt like to reach the end, with nothing but an empire and an empty house. He knew the hollow victory of success, without someone to share it with. In his own twisted, controlling way, He was trying to save her from the same fate. The clause wasn't a punishment. It was a desperate, posthumous plea from a dying man who finally understood what he had missed. Vivian pulled up the company's employee database on her computer, not entirely sure what she was looking for. She scrolled through faces and names, past marketing executives and sales managers, past the ambitious young analysts who reminded her too much of herself. And then she stopped. Derek Holloway, accounting department. Floor 12. The photo showed a man in his late 30s with kind eyes and a hint of stubble along his jaw. But it wasn't the photo that made her pause. It was the notation in his file, approved for flexible schedule due to single-parent status. She had noticed Derek before, though she had never admitted it to anyone, least of all herself. 2 years ago, during a fire drill that had forced everyone onto the street, she had watched him standing apart from his colleagues, phone pressed to his ear, his voice soft and reassuring as he talked to someone on the other end. "I know, sweetheart. Daddy will be there soon. The building just had a little alarm, that's all. You be brave for me, okay?" There was something about the way his entire demeanor changed when he spoke to his daughter, something that made Vivian's chest tighten with an emotion she couldn't name. After that day, she found herself noticing him more often, the way he always took the stairs instead of the elevator, probably to avoid the awkward small talk with executives. The way he kept a small photo in his wallet that he would glance at during long meetings, a smile ghosting across his lips. The way he never stayed late for drinks with colleagues, always apologizing and explaining that he had someone waiting for him at home. She had never spoken to him beyond the occasional nod in the hallway, never found an excuse to call him into her office. Because what would she say? What could a woman who had everything possibly want from a man who had nothing but a daughter and a fifth-floor apartment? Now, staring at his employee file, Vivian realized that Derek Holloway had everything she didn't. He had love. He had family. He had someone who waited by the window for him to come home. And she, with all her billions and board meetings, had nothing but an ultimatum from a dead man and 6 months to change her entire life. She pressed the intercom button. "Patricia, ask Derek Holloway from accounting to come to my office. Tell him it's urgent." Her assistant's surprise was audible even through the speaker. Derek Holloway, from the 12th floor? Vivian closed her eyes, steadying herself. "Yes. And Patricia? Hold all my other calls." The minutes stretched like hours as she waited. She tried to compose what she would say, how she would explain this impossible situation to a man who probably didn't even know her first name. She rehearsed different approaches, different angles, but nothing sounded right. How do you ask someone to help you create a life when you've spent your entire existence avoiding exactly that? When the knock finally came, Vivian's heart seized in her chest. She watched Derek enter, saw the confusion flicker across his face as he took in the expanse of her corner office. So different from the cramped cubicles of the 12th floor. He was wearing a simple blue dress shirt, slightly wrinkled, and there was a small stain near the collar that looked like it might be from breakfast. Jam, maybe, or syrup. The imperfection made him more real than anyone who had ever stood in this office. Ms. Sterling? His voice was cautious, professional, but there was something underneath, a quiet steadiness that made her want to tell him everything. "You wanted to see me?" Vivian gestured to the chair across from her desk, but she didn't sit. Instead, she walked to the window, unable to face him for what she was about to say. The city sprawled below them, indifferent and vast, and somewhere down there, his daughter was probably doing homework or watching cartoons, unaware that her father's life was about to intersect with the most powerful woman in the building. "Mr. Holloway, I'm going to say something that will sound insane. I need you to hear me out before you respond." She turned to face him, and the words that had been trapped in her throat for 2 years finally found their way out. I need a baby, or I lose everything." The silence that followed was deafening. Derek stared at her, his expression unreadable, and Vivian forced herself to continue. "My father left a clause in his will. If I don't have a biological child within 6 months, I lose the company. I lose everything I've worked for my entire life." She paused, her voice cracking slightly. "I've watched you for 2 years. I know that sounds strange, maybe even inappropriate, but I have. You're the only person in this building who seems to have figured out what actually matters. You leave at 5 to pick up your daughter. You don't stay for happy hours or networking events. You have a life outside these walls, and I—" She stopped, the confession catching in her throat. "I don't know how to do any of that, but I want to learn, and I'm hoping you might help me." Derek's eyes widened, processing her words. He looked at her, really looked at her, past the designer suit and the corner office and the reputation that preceded her everywhere she went. And for a moment, Vivian saw something shift in his expression, a recognition of something she hadn't expected him to see. "You've been watching me?" he asked quietly, not with accusation, but with genuine surprise. "The CEO of this company has been watching a mid-level accountant?" Vivian felt her cheeks flush, a sensation so foreign she almost didn't recognize it. "I noticed you during a fire drill 2 years ago. You were on the phone with your daughter, telling her to be brave. And I thought—" She stopped, unsure how to finish. "I thought you were the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen." The words hung between them, vulnerable and raw. Derek stood slowly, his chair scraping against the marble floor. He walked toward her, stopping just a few feet away, close enough that she could smell coffee and something else, something warm and lived in, like laundry detergent and morning toast. "You don't need a baby, Ms. Sterling," he said softly. "You need a family, and those are 2 very different things." Vivian blinked, caught off guard by his insight. "I'm not sure I know the difference." Derek studied her for a long moment, and then something shifted in his eyes, a decision being made. "Meet my condition tonight," he said finally. "Come to my apartment at 7. My daughter's name is Rosie, and she's 7 years old. Tonight, you're going to cook dinner with us, eat at our table, and see what a family actually looks like. No assistants, no drivers, no corporate masks, just you." Vivian stared at him, her mind racing. "And if I do this?" Derek shrugged, a hint of a smile playing at the corner of his lips. "Then we'll talk. But I won't bring a child into this world as part of a business deal. If you want my help, you need to prove that you can love someone without a contract." He turned to leave, pausing at the door to look back at her. 7 o'clock. Building C, apartment 52. "And Ms. Sterling?" He met her eyes with a warmth that made her breath catch. "Wear something you don't mind getting dirty. Rosie likes to help with the cooking, and she's not exactly neat." The door clicked shut behind him, leaving Vivian alone in her corner office, with the city lights beginning to flicker on below. She stood motionless for several minutes, her mind replaying every word, every glance, every impossible moment of the conversation. Derek Holloway hadn't asked for money. He hadn't asked for promotions, or favors, or any of the things she had expected. He had asked her to cook dinner with a 7-year-old girl, to sit at a small table in a 5th-floor apartment, and pretend, even for one night, that she was capable of being ordinary. It was the most terrifying request anyone had ever made of her. At precisely 7 o'clock, Vivian stood outside apartment 52, in a building that didn't have a doorman or a concierge, or any of the luxuries she had come to expect from the places she inhabited. The hallway smelled like a mixture of cooking spices and floor cleaner, and somewhere above her, she could hear children laughing, their joy echoing through the thin walls. She was wearing jeans for the first time in years, paired with a simple cashmere sweater that suddenly felt too expensive, too out of place in this world of scuffed linoleum and flickering fluorescent lights. The door swung open before she could knock, and there was Derek, still in his work shirt, but with the sleeves rolled up now, revealing forearms dusted with flour. Behind him, she could see a small kitchen filled with warm light and the chaos of a meal in progress. "You came," he said, and there was genuine surprise in his voice, as if he hadn't been entirely sure she would. "I said I would," Vivian replied, and then, from somewhere behind Derek, a small face appeared. Rosie Holloway had her father's eyes, brown and curious, magnified slightly by the pink-framed glasses perched on her nose. Her curly hair was pulled back in 2 uneven pigtails, and she was wearing an apron that was several sizes too big, the strings wrapped twice around her tiny waist. She looked up at Vivian with the unfiltered assessment that only children possess, taking in this strange woman on her doorstep. "Are you the lady from Daddy's work?" Rosie asked, her head tilted to one side. "Daddy said you're learning how to cook. I can teach you. I'm really good at stirring." Vivian felt something shift in her chest, a tightness loosening that she hadn't even known was there. She knelt down so she was eye level with the little girl. "I would love that," she said softly. "I'm Vivian." Rosie considered this for a moment. "That's a pretty name. You can call me Rosie. Everyone does except my teacher, who calls me Rosamond. But I don't like that because it sounds like a sneeze." The apartment was small, barely bigger than Vivian's closet at home, but it was filled with something her penthouse had never possessed: warmth. Drawings covered the refrigerator door, held up by magnets shaped like letters and animals. A basket of laundry sat in the corner, waiting to be folded. Books were stacked on every available surface, from children's picture books to worn paperbacks with cracked spines. And in the center of it all was a tiny kitchen, where Derek was already returning to his post at the stove. "We're making mac and cheese," Rosie announced, tugging at Vivian's hand to pull her into the kitchen. "From scratch, not from a box. Daddy says the box kind is cheating." Vivian allowed herself to be led, feeling like she had stepped through a portal into an entirely different universe. The kitchen was barely big enough for 2 people, let alone 3, and she found herself standing close to Derek, their shoulders almost touching as he showed her how to make a roux. "Start with the butter," he instructed, his voice patient. "Let it melt completely before you add the flour." Vivian watched his hands move with practiced ease, the same hands that typed numbers into spreadsheets, all day transformed into something graceful and sure in this small space. She tried to mimic his movements, but when she added the flour, a cloud of white powder erupted into the air, dusting her sweater and making Rosie giggle. "You have to go slow," Rosie advised sagely, climbing onto a step stool to peer into the pot. "Daddy always says cooking is about patience." Vivian looked at the mess she had made, at the flour coating her expensive cashmere, and felt something bubble up from her chest. A laugh. A genuine, surprised laugh that she couldn't remember the last time she had made. Derek was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher, something soft and almost wondering. As the evening progressed, Vivian learned things that no business school had ever taught her. She learned that cheese sauce requires constant stirring, or it will stick to the bottom of the pot. She learned that Rosie's favorite color was purple, because it was the color of the flowers that grew on her mother's grave. She learned that Derek had been a single father for 3 years, ever since his wife lost her battle with cancer, and that he had spent every day since trying to be enough for the little girl who had lost her mother at 4 years old. They ate at a small table by the window, the kind of table that would have fit inside Vivian's dining room a dozen times over. Rosie chattered about school, about her best friend, whose name was impossible to pronounce, about the book she was reading about a mouse who went on adventures. And Vivian found herself listening, really listening, in a way she never did during board meetings or investor calls. This wasn't information to be processed or leveraged. This was just life. Messy and ordinary, and somehow more valuable than anything she had ever acquired. Miss Vivi. Rosie's voice broke through her thoughts. The nickname surprised her, made her heart do something strange and unfamiliar. Yes, sweetheart? The endearment slipped out before she could stop it, and she saw Derek's eyebrows rise slightly. Do you get lonely when you go home at night? The question was innocent, without agenda, the way only a child's question could be. Vivian felt her throat tighten. No one had ever asked her that. Not her assistant, not her board members, not even the therapist she had seen briefly in her 30s. She looked at this little girl with her flour-dusted glasses and her earnest eyes, and told her the truth. Yes, she whispered, I get very lonely. Rosie nodded solemnly, as if this confession made perfect sense. Daddy used to be lonely too, after Mommy went to heaven. But then he said he wasn't anymore, because he has me, and I told him that was silly because I was there the whole time. She paused, considering. Maybe you need someone who's there the whole time too. After dinner, Rosie insisted on showing Vivian her room, which was barely bigger than a closet, but filled with treasures. There were drawings tacked to every wall, most of them featuring 3 figures. A tall one, a small one, and someone in the middle with wings. That's Mommy, Rosie explained, pointing to the winged figure. She watches us from heaven. Daddy says she can see everything I do, so I try to be really good. Vivian knelt beside the little girl, looking at the drawings with new eyes. On the small desk, she noticed a sketch that was different from the others, newer, with the paper still crisp. It showed 3 people standing in front of what looked like an apartment building. 2 of them were clearly Derek and Rosie, but the 3rd figure was a woman with long, dark hair, standing slightly apart, as if she wasn't quite sure she belonged. Who's this? Vivian asked softly, already knowing the answer. Rosie glanced at the drawing and then back at Vivian, suddenly shy. That's supposed to be you, she admitted. I drew it today after Daddy told me you were coming. I wanted to see what it would look like if you were in our family. The words hit Vivian like a physical force. This child, this beautiful, perceptive child, had already imagined her into their world. When it was time to leave, Vivian found herself reluctant to go. The apartment was warm and full of the lingering smell of cheese and butter, and Rosie had already started yawning, her energy finally fading after an evening of non-stop chatter. Derek walked her to the door while Rosie waved sleepily from the couch. Same time tomorrow? Derek asked, and there was something in his voice that made Vivian's heart skip. The week isn't over yet, she nodded, not trusting herself to speak. As she stepped into the hallway, Derek caught her arm gently. Vivian. It was the first time he had used her first name. You did good tonight. The mac and cheese was terrible, but you did good. She laughed again, that same surprised sound that felt like it belonged to someone else. Thank you for the honest feedback. Derek smiled, and in the dim light of the hallway, he looked younger somehow. The weight of single parenthood momentarily lifted. See you tomorrow, Miss Sterling. The door closed, and Vivian stood in the corridor for a long moment, listening to the muffled sounds of Derek getting Rosie ready for bed. The domestic symphony of a life she had never known. The first week stretched into 2, then 3, then a month. Vivian found herself rearranging her schedule in ways she never had before, declining dinner meetings and delegating evening calls so she could be at apartment 52 by 7. She learned to make more than mac and cheese, graduating to simple pasta dishes and eventually attempting a chicken recipe that Rosie declared almost as good as Daddy's. She learned to braid hair, though her attempts were still lopsided and required constant adjustment. She learned the names of all of Rosie's stuffed animals and the intricate social dynamics of second-grade friendships. But more than that, she learned what it felt like to be wanted. Not for her money or her influence or her ability to make things happen with a single phone call, but for herself. Rosie would run to the door every evening, throwing her arms around Vivian's waist with an enthusiasm that never seemed to diminish. Derek would hand her a glass of wine and ask about her day, actually listening to the answer. And slowly, without realizing it was happening, Vivian began to feel the walls she had built around her heart start to crumble. There were moments that caught her off guard. One evening, while helping Rosie with homework at the small kitchen table, Derek had reached over to brush a strand of hair from Vivian's face. His fingers lingered for just a second longer than necessary, and when their eyes met, she saw something there that made her breath catch. Another night, when Rosie had fallen asleep on the couch between them, Derek had taken Vivian's hand in his own, saying nothing, just holding on as if she might disappear. But the doubts crept in too, in the quiet hours of the night when she returned to her empty penthouse. Did he care for her, or for what she could provide for Rosie? Was she falling for him, or for the idea of the family she had never had? And beneath it all, the question that haunted her. When he found out the truth, when he realized she had come to him because of a clause in a will, would he forgive her? The whispers at work had started almost immediately. Vivian Sterling, seen entering a modest apartment building in a non-fashionable neighborhood. The CEO's car, parked on a street where it clearly didn't belong. By week 3, the speculation had reached the board of directors, and Vivian found herself fielding pointed questions during meetings. "Is everything all right at home?" Board member Charles Weston asked with false concern, his eyes gleaming with barely concealed ambition. "We've noticed you've been leaving early quite often." Vivian kept her face neutral, her voice steady. "My personal life is my own concern." But she saw the looks exchanged around the table, the subtle shifts in alliance. Charles Weston had been waiting for a weakness, any crack in her armor that he could exploit. And now, with her father's claws looming over everything, she was more vulnerable than ever. One night, as they washed dishes together in Derek's tiny kitchen, Vivian finally voiced the fear that had been growing inside her. "Derek, I need to tell you something." He turned off the water, giving her his full attention. "I know about the pictures," he said quietly. "Someone from your company has been taking photos of you coming here. I found one on my car windshield last week." Vivian felt the blood drain from her face. "What did it say?" Derek reached into a drawer and handed her a crumpled piece of paper. The photograph showed her entering his building, and beneath it, in block letters, "How much is she paying you?" "I didn't know how to bring it up," Derek admitted. "I figured you had enough to worry about." "But Vivian, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." The words hung in the air between them. Vivian set down the dish she had been drying, her hand suddenly trembling. "Ask me." Derek turned to face her fully, his expression serious. "Why did you really come to me that day? You said you needed a baby, that you'd been watching me. But there has to be more to it. Someone like you doesn't just approach a random employee for something like this." Vivian closed her eyes, knowing that this moment would define everything that came after. "My father left a clause in his will," she began, and then told him everything. The ultimatum, the 6-month deadline, the controlling interest that would slip through her fingers if she didn't produce an heir. She watched his face as she spoke, searching for the anger or betrayal she expected to see, but found only quiet contemplation. When she finished, Derek was silent for a long moment. Then he reached out and tilted her chin up so she was looking directly at him. "That's why you came to me initially," he said slowly. "But is that why you stayed?" The question cut through all her defenses. "No," she whispered. "I stayed because of the way Rosie laughs when she tells a joke. I stayed because you make the best coffee I've ever tasted, and you pretend not to notice when I steal sips from your cup. I stayed because last Tuesday, when I had a migraine, you made me lie down on your couch and read to Rosie in whispers so I could rest. The tears were falling now, and she couldn't stop them. I stayed because somewhere between the mac and cheese disasters and the bedtime stories, I fell in love with both of you. And I don't know what to do about it because I've never loved anyone before, and I'm terrified I'm doing it wrong. Derek pulled her into his arms, and she let herself be held in a way she had never allowed before. "You're not doing it wrong," he murmured against her hair. "You're doing it exactly right." When Rosie got sick with a high fever in the 4th week, Vivian discovered a part of herself she didn't know existed. She stayed up all night beside Derek, taking turns placing cool cloths on Rosie's forehead, singing lullabies she didn't even know she remembered from her own childhood. At 3 in the morning, with Rosie finally sleeping peacefully, Derek found Vivian crying silently in the kitchen. "Hey," he said softly, pulling her close. "She's going to be fine. It's just a bug." Vivian shook her head, unable to explain the overwhelming terror she had felt, watching that little girl burning with fever. "I've never been this scared in my life," she admitted. "Not during hostile takeovers or market crashes or any of the things that are supposed to matter. But watching her sick, thinking something might happen to her." She couldn't finish. Derek looked at her with something like wonder. "That's what it feels like to be a parent," he said quietly. "It's terrifying. It's the most terrifying thing in the world, loving someone that much." He cupped her face in his hands, wiping away her tears with his thumbs. "But Vivian, don't you see? You already are one. A parent, I mean. Rosie loves you. She asks about you every morning before school. She drew a picture of you for show and tell and told her whole class that you're her." He stopped, but Vivian caught the word he hadn't said. "Her what?" The next morning, Rosie's fever had broken, and she woke up demanding pancakes with a healthy appetite that erased all the fear of the night before. As they sat together at the small breakfast table, Rosie between them, Vivian caught sight of the photograph on the shelf above the sink. Derek's wife smiled out from the frame, frozen forever at 32, beautiful and gentle, and everything that Vivian had never been. "You're not replacing her," Derek said softly, following her gaze. "I know that's what you're thinking. But loving you doesn't mean I love her any less. Hearts expand, Vivian. They don't replace." She turned to look at him, this man who had somehow found room in a heart that had already known such loss. "How do you do it?" she asked. "How do you let yourself love again when you know how much it can hurt?" Derek reached across the table and took her hand. "Because the alternative is worse. I spent a year after she died, just going through the motions, afraid to feel anything because feeling meant hurting. And then Rosie drew me a picture of her and me together, and she asked why Daddy never smiled anymore. And I realized that closing myself off wasn't protecting anyone. It was just teaching my daughter that love wasn't worth the risk." The board meeting came faster than Vivian had expected. 6 weeks into her time with Derek and Rosie, Charles Weston made his move. He presented photographs of Vivian's visits to Derek's apartment, insinuating that she was engaged in some kind of inappropriate relationship with an employee, using company resources for personal gain. The accusations were ridiculous, easily disproved, but the damage was intentional. He wanted to humiliate her, to weaken her position before the 6-month deadline arrived. Vivian sat at the head of the table, watching the board members shift uncomfortably in their seats. Some avoided her eyes, others stared openly, waiting to see how she would respond. This was the moment she had prepared for her entire career, the moment when everything depended on her ability to project strength and control. But as she opened her mouth to deliver the calculated response she had rehearsed, something unexpected happened. She thought of Rosie's drawings, of Derek's steady hands teaching her to cook, of the warmth of that tiny apartment that had somehow become more of a home than anywhere she had ever lived. And she realized that she didn't want to play this game anymore. "Charles," she said calmly, "you're right. I have been spending time at the apartment of Derek Holloway, an employee of this company. I've been doing it because I'm in love with him and his daughter, and I intend to marry him if he'll have me." The room fell silent. Charles Weston's face went from triumphant to confused in the span of a second. "Furthermore," Vivian continued, "I'm aware of my father's clause regarding an heir, and I want to inform this board that I'm prepared to relinquish my controlling interest rather than bring a child into this world for the purpose of maintaining my position." The uproar was immediate. Board members shouted over each other, demanding explanations, threatening legal action. But Vivian remained calm at the center of the storm. "My father didn't include that clause because he wanted me to have a business arrangement disguised as a family," she said, her voice cutting through the chaos. "He included it because he wanted me to find what he never did, real love, real connection. And I have. If that means losing this company, then so be it, because I've finally found something worth more than all of it." After the meeting, Vivian didn't return to her office. Instead, she drove directly to Derek's apartment, not caring that it was the middle of the workday, not caring about anything except seeing the two people who had somehow become her entire world. Derek answered the door with Rosie peeking out from behind him, home early from school for a teacher training day. "I heard about the board meeting," Derek said quietly. "Word travels fast." Vivian nodded, suddenly exhausted, the adrenaline of the confrontation finally fading. "I told them about us, about everything. I told them I'd give up the company before I'd give up you." Derek pulled her inside, and Rosie immediately wrapped herself around Vivian's legs. "Miss Vivi, are you okay? You look like you need hot chocolate." They sat together on the small couch, Rosie curled between them, and Derek handed her a mug of hot chocolate that was mostly marshmallows, just the way Rosie liked it. "I have something to show you," Rosie announced, wiggling free to run to her room. She returned with a piece of paper clutched to her chest, suddenly shy. "I made this for you. Daddy said I should wait for the right time, but I think this is the right time." She handed Vivian the drawing, and Vivian's breath caught in her throat. 3 figures stood hand in hand under a rainbow, their stick figure faces all curved into enormous smiles. Above them, in Rosie's careful printing, were the words, "My family." There was Derek, tall with scribbled brown hair. There was Rosie, small with glasses. And there was Vivian, standing not apart as she had been in the earlier drawing, but right beside them, connected, belonging. "That's you," Rosie explained unnecessarily, pointing to the figure on the left. "I put you there because that's where you're supposed to be. You're part of our family now." The tears came then, and Vivian didn't try to stop them. She pulled Rosie into her arms, holding on tight to this little girl who had somehow seen through all her walls and decided she was worth keeping. Derek's arms came around both of them, creating a circle that felt, for the first time in Vivian's life, like home. "You don't need the company to have value," he murmured against her hair. "You've had value since the first night you burned that mac and cheese. We chose you, Vivian. Not your money, not your position. You." She laughed through her tears. "The mac and cheese was pretty terrible." Rosie looked up, her glasses slightly askew. "It was really bad," she agreed solemnly. "But Daddy says we love you anyway." The next week, Vivian walked into the board meeting with Derek at her side, and a sense of peace she had never known before. The lawyers had gathered, the board members assembled, all waiting to hear the final verdict on Robert Sterling's clause. Vivian took her place at the head of the table, but this time, Derek stood beside her, his hand warm in hers. "I've called this meeting to inform you of my decision regarding my father's inheritance clause," she began, her voice steady. "I have chosen not to pursue maintaining my position through the means my father specified. I will not have a child merely to satisfy a legal requirement." The murmurs began, but she raised her hand. However, I want you to know why. My father, for all his faults, understood something that took me 42 years to learn. Success means nothing without someone to share it with. He put that clause in his will not to punish me, but to wake me up. And it worked. She looked at Derek, drawing strength from his steady presence. I found what he wanted me to find, not through manipulation or business arrangements, but through burned mac and cheese and bedtime stories and a 7-year-old girl who draws pictures of families. The lawyer cleared his throat, and Vivian turned to face him. There's actually one more element to the clause that hasn't been revealed yet, he said, his voice formal, but with a hint of something warmer underneath. Your father included a contingency. He read from the document. If my daughter Vivian demonstrates, through actions rather than convenience, that she has found genuine love and genuine family, regardless of biological children, she will have proved herself worthy of the Sterling legacy. The true heir to Sterling Industries is not determined by blood, but by heart. Vivian stared at the lawyer, processing his words. What does that mean? It means, Derek said softly, that your father knew exactly what he was doing. He set up a test, and you passed it. Not by having a baby, but by being willing to give everything up for love. The lawyer nodded. The clause states that if you entered into a genuine, loving relationship, evidenced by consistent actions over a period of at least 1 month, and were willing to sacrifice your inheritance for that relationship, then the clause becomes null and void. The inheritance is yours unconditionally. The irony wasn't lost on Vivian. Her father, the man who had never expressed love through anything but control, had crafted the most elaborate love letter imaginable. He had forced her to find what he never could, and then rewarded her for having the courage to choose it over everything else. 6 months later, Vivian Sterling walked through the doors of her penthouse apartment for the last time. The movers had taken everything except the photograph on her desk, the one of her and her father from her college graduation. She picked it up, looking at the 2 figures standing stiffly side by side. I understand now, she whispered to the image. Thank you. Derek was waiting downstairs with Rosie, the car packed with the essentials they would need for their new home. Not the penthouse, not the mansion in the suburbs that Vivian could easily afford. Instead, they had chosen a modest house with a backyard big enough for a swing set, in a neighborhood where children rode bikes on the sidewalks and families waved to each other from front porches. Vivian slid into the passenger seat, and Rosie immediately leaned forward from the back. Mom, Vivi, can we get ice cream on the way? The word hit her differently now than it had the first time Rosie had used it. Mom, Vivi, a title she had never expected to hold, given freely by a child who had chosen her just as much as she had chosen them. I think that can be arranged, Vivian said, catching Derek's eye and sharing a smile that held everything they had built together. The car pulled away from the building that had once represented everything Vivian thought she wanted. Behind her, the 40th floor gleamed in the afternoon sun, the corner office where it all began, now just another window in a skyline full of them. That evening, they sat together at the dinner table in their new home, eating mac and cheese that Vivian had made from scratch. It still wasn't as good as Derek's, but Rosie declared it almost perfect, which was high praise indeed. Outside the window, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and somewhere down the street, children were laughing as they played in the last light of day. Mom, Vivi. Rosie's voice was sleepy now, the excitement of moving day finally catching up with her. Yes, sweetheart, Vivian answered automatically, still marveling at how natural the exchange had become. Are you going to come home early tomorrow, too? The question, so simple and so profound, made Vivian's heart swell. She reached across the table, taking Derek's hand with one of hers, and Rosie's with the other. "Tomorrow," she said, "and every day after that." Derek squeezed her hand, his eyes holding hers, with a love she still sometimes couldn't believe was real. "Forever," he added quietly. Rosie nodded sagely, satisfied with this answer. "Good, because I need someone to help me set up my new room, and Daddy says he's bad at decorating." Later that night, after Rosie was asleep in her new room surrounded by stuffed animals and half-unpacked boxes, Derek and Vivian stood on the back porch, looking up at a sky full of stars that were never visible from the 40th floor. "Do you miss it?" Derek asked quietly. "The corner office? The view?" Vivian considered the question seriously. There were moments, she knew, when she would miss the rush of a successful deal, the respect in board members' eyes, the knowledge that she could move markets with a single decision. But standing here, in a modest backyard, with a man who loved her for who she was, and a child sleeping peacefully inside, she realized that she had traded a view of the world for something far more valuable. "No," she said finally. "I spent 40 years watching life happen from 40 stories up. I never realized what I was missing until I came down to where the living actually happens." Derek pulled her close, and she leaned into his warmth. "Your father would be proud of you," he murmured. "The real you, not the CEO you. The woman who burns mac and cheese and tells terrible bedtime stories and cries at Rosie's school plays." Vivian smiled against his shoulder. "My bedtime stories are getting better." Derek laughed, the sound rumbling through his chest. "They're really not. But Rosie loves them anyway." They stood there together, two people who had found each other through the most unlikely circumstances, building a family from hope and trust and the courage to be vulnerable. Inside the house, the photograph of Vivian's father had found a new home on the mantel, right next to the picture of Derek's late wife, and a new frame holding Rosie's drawing of her family. 3 photographs, 3 different versions of love, all coexisting in a space that somehow held room for all of them. The corner office on the 40th floor still stood, gleaming glass and corporate power, but it no longer belonged to Vivian Sterling. She had promoted someone worthy to take her place, had stepped back from the day-to-day operations that once consumed her entire existence. Now she worked from home 3 days a week, attending school performances and soccer games, and all the small moments that make up a life. And every evening, at precisely 6 o'clock, she would stand at the kitchen window of their modest home, watching for Derek's car to turn into the driveway. Rosie would press her nose against the glass beside her, counting the seconds until Daddy was home. And when the door finally opened, when Derek stepped through with his tired smile and his arms ready to hold them both, Vivian would feel something she had never known in 42 years of achievement and success. She would feel complete. The mac and cheese pot still sat on the stove, waiting for the final stir that only Derek's practiced hand could provide. Rosie was already setting the table, chattering about her day and the endless stream of consciousness that Vivian had come to find more precious than any symphony. And outside the window, the city lights were beginning to flicker on, thousands of small windows glowing with their own stories of love and loss and everything in between. But in this kitchen, at this table, with these people, Vivian finally understood what her father had been trying to tell her all along. The greatest inheritance wasn't money or power or corporate control. It was the knowledge that love was worth the risk, that family was worth the sacrifice, and that sometimes the most powerful thing a person could do was let go of everything they thought they wanted and hold on tight to everything they actually needed. "Dinner's ready," Derek announced, carrying the pot to the table. Rosie cheered, and Vivian found herself smiling so wide her cheeks hurt. This was her life now. Small dinners in a small kitchen, with people who loved her, not for what she had, but for who she was. And as she took her seat at the table that could have fit inside her old office a dozen times over, she realized that she wouldn't trade it for all the corner offices in the world. "I love you," she said suddenly, the words still new enough to feel like a miracle every time they left her lips. Derek and Rosie both looked up, their faces mirroring the same surprised joy. "We love you too, Mom Vivi," Rosie said matter-of-factly, as if this were the most obvious thing in the world. "Now please pass the cheese." And in that moment, surrounded by the warmth of the family she never knew she needed, Vivian Sterling finally understood what it meant to have everything. Not because she owned it, but because she had been brave enough to let herself be owned by love. The end.